Welcome to the Visibility Project Podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project Podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project Podcast.
Started by a group of citizens in a small Michigan town with a like-minded goal
of increasing the visibility
of the unseen and unheard populations in our community.
Our guests will share stories and insights
with the goal of increasing our awareness and knowledge
of various aspects of diversity and equity
to create a more connected, empathetic, and inclusive community.
So, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
So, let's get to work.
So, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
Welcome to the final episode of the Visibility Project Podcast. We are your hosts, Amy Phoenix
and Jeremiah Lee.
In this final episode, we wanted to reflect on the over 3 years of production and 33 episodes that have been produced.
And the Visibility Project Podcast has been driven by volunteers who have dedicated their work to creating a more inclusive and connected community. And over the years, our volunteer group and our capacity to carry on the work has changed and evolved. And we've been so grateful to bring the stories of the unseen and unheard populations in our community to the forefront. And through this podcast, it's been our hope that our efforts have sparked a change in the lives that we've touched through this podcast. And we hope that the work continues for all of the individuals who have been a part of this podcast, and especially to all of you listeners as well. So let's dive into some questions. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeremiah. So Jeremiah, you were one of the original founders of the Visibility Project Podcast. Can you please share with us what was the inspiration for this podcast?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Amy. So this started way back in the fall of 2019, pre-COVID, right? There's a group of us, volunteers in the community of Midland, Michigan, and we were like, okay. I was working at Northwood University at the time, and I put on a project called the Human Library, which is it's a DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion type of event where we have people at different tables. And just like when you go to a library, you check out a book and read its story. The Human Library, you go to this event and you check out a person to hear their story. And it's all about storytelling and empathizing with somebody and sitting at a table and listening to their background and their stories and asking questions, and then moving on to the next table to check out that book. So I did it at my university. And then there's a group of us volunteers in the community who were like, how can we do this for the community itself? So we put on a public Human Library event. Had hundreds of people attend to it. This was in the fall of 2019, and we had a lot of energy. We're like, that was awesome. We felt like we made a positive impact on the community. And then we were like, okay, what's next? And we were planning like an inclusion conference or different things. And then the world changed because COVID hit. So we're like, okay, we have all this energy and momentum. We really are interested in this ideas of storytelling and sharing the stories of those unseen and unheard voices. So how do we do that? So it was really this energy of storytelling and having real, authentic conversations with people. And in a way, it's like in this, now COVID world, how do we do that? Well, and that's how we landed on this idea of the podcast. And was really all about storytelling and sharing those stories and having authentic, real conversations that maybe aren't heard from day to day, or maybe it's a conversation you wouldn't have with somebody or background you wouldn't actually normally have. And so that was the idea behind the project, was to carry that momentum and to, continue this storytelling to a broader audience. So that's really how we kind of got started. And then we continued on with it, and years, like episode after episode, it became monthly. And like you said, 33 episodes, and 3 years later, this is where we're at. So I hope that we achieved our goal, right, of, sharing stories and that storytelling aspect, and that developing empathy for one another was the goal from the beginning. And I think that we've done that. I know I've grown from being the host, and I'm sure you have as well. And I hope our listeners have learned from people sharing their stories and have maybe taken that ideas and move forward with their own life. And it's all lived in one way or another. So that's kind of how we started out, I guess. Was just COVID hit us in the face, and we had to adapt, as we all did, right? And that's where the kind of idea landed us.
That's beautiful. And what a wonderful way to adapt and stay connected during those times that were so challenging for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. It really was a challenge. And how do we stay connected? And we did so by interviewing people like you. And you were one of our early on guests, right? In our first year or so. So a question for you, Amy, since you were first a guest on the podcast, you were a guest, and then you took over more responsibilities as both the host and the chair over the past year and a half, which is a huge role. So for you, what were some of the highlights, and also what are some of the challenges of putting on this podcast? So what were some of the highlights and challenges, both as a guest, as a host, as a chair, of all the roles you served over the years with us?
Oh yeah, thank you. As a guest, I remember when I first heard about the podcast, and I wondered what it would be like and what kind of stories would be told. And I had some experience with the Human Library, so I didn't know exactly how close it would be. And some of the challenges in being a guest is just opening up to whoever is going to listen. And at the same time, also knowing that stories told really help shame reduce, and it can help another person not only have empathy and understanding, but you never know who's got what story that they're not able to share, and how it could be supportive to them to know they're not alone, and also that people make their way through things that can be hard. So those were some of the highlights and challenges of being a guest, and then coming into the fold as chair. It was interesting for me personally. I had a lot of things going on at the time. So I remember wanting to do it well and wanting to be connecting with my community. I had done some community volunteer work in the past, but it had been some years due to some family things and, children growing and all those things that we have in our lives that take up importance. And I remember being like, I want to do this well and honor this podcast and honor how it was started and what it was about. And so some of the challenges were just understanding the different strengths and roles and needs and interests of the people who were helping. And also, like, what do we need to do as people's needs and capacities change? Because obviously, volunteer efforts, the ability of the volunteers to be able to continue is going to change over time. It was also, I really appreciated the passion. I still appreciate the passion of the people who have been involved, both guests and the volunteers and the people working with the podcast, and bringing the heart of we want to create connection here. We want to create space where people can be themselves, share their stories, learn about each other, and really thrive more in our communities instead of people staying in judgment or in their little groups.
Sure. Yeah.
thinking we know things and maybe we don't about people in their lives. And then moving into host, I feel like someone sharing their story really is a sacred experience. It's their journey. Like it's life. You can't get more sacred than just being here and being alive. I mean, somebody could say that you could, but I think that's where it all comes home. And so in people sharing their stories, it's felt humbling and I felt appreciative, and also wanting that kind of work to continue in even other capacities in the community,
Right.
whether it's a podcast or not, just having that wanting that space for people to share story, listen, reflect, learn, show caring. I really wanted that to be able to continue. So those are some of the highlights and challenges, and I think that's probably common to a lot of community efforts.
Sure. And I think I agree with you, like as a host role, like it's such a humble experience where you're interviewing somebody and hearing their story. And, I definitely, like, our listeners can't see the video, and sometimes I'm glad, because I was definitely crying during some episodes, hearing some of the stories, and it's so impactful. And a lot of the stories I carry with me, right? And it were heavy, and but it is humbling that, to hear the lives of somebody. And I was also a guest on one episode, and that was hard. That was, I share I empathize with you there, that, like, being vulnerable, right? And for me, the same thing is, I hope somebody listens to this and it resonates with somebody and makes a positive impact on my story, right? And it's scary doing it. So I had a lot of respect for those guests who came on to share their stories, and was humbled that they did so, because it's not easy to share something, and because it's a vulnerability people are sharing with you when they share their stories. And it's a little bit different, like at the Human Library when they're sitting at a table and it's not recorded and people can't like go back and listen to it and hear you fumble over a question or whatever that looks like, right?
Yeah.
In person, it's a little bit different sometimes to create that connection. It can be a little more challenging for a podcast. So that's why I was really thankful for all of our guests throughout the years.
So Jeremiah, what do you hope this podcast contributed and continues to contribute to the Midland, Michigan community and to the audience overall?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Amy, and I'm sure you have some thoughts here too. But I moved away from Midland like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, actually, I guess. I live in San Francisco now. So like I want this podcast. I wanted and I still want this podcast for people to listen to it. And we tried to get guests from the local community or Midland area or Michigan area as much as possible because we wanted it to, one, people to hear these stories, but two, to like make that connection with people who maybe they know, maybe they don't. So I hope that people, grew their network, one, right? So I hope that they like heard people. I'm like, oh my gosh, I never realized Amy's story if they heard yours and knew you, right? So those are local connections. But for me, coming away from and we had listeners all over the world. Like we were tracking the data about so we had people listening in France and Syria and all over the world. So I hope the people listening to it, I hope the impact wasn't just Midland, right? That was the goal of it, right? Because our podcast, was a collaborative effort of Midland individuals, and we were like, a part of the Midland Area Community Foundation's Cultural Awareness Coalition at the end, right? So the aim was to have a positive impact for the local community, but I think that the scope would be beyond that. So, and what I really hope is it developed empathy in others, like both in our community and the broader community. It's like, and that was the goal, was to develop empathy. Like we can, all these like top-down like inclusion trainings or something like that, like, oh, here your company's making you do inclusion training or whatever this looks like. If you don't have the intrinsic drive to do that, sometimes those like efforts can fall on deaf ears. So for me, at least, that all starts with empathy. If you don't have empathy and this desire to learn about the differences in other people, then when you actually are like told to learn about it, it's going to fall on deaf ears. So when you have that empathy and drive to listen to and learn from somebody else, it starts from there. And then everything else. Okay, I'm curious, right? I'm empathetic and I'm curious. From there, then we can learn more. Then we can hear an individual story and apply it to like broader themes, or is this person's story, wow, I never thought about that. Like, I bet that impacts people from that background more holistically, right? And we can start to apply those to, broader lessons. But really, it starts with hearing somebody's story, empathizing with it, having compassion for them, and being like, wow, I never seen it from their perspective. And now I'm curious what I could have done differently, or what I can do, or how this impacts others. Like, it sparks that curiosity. That's my personal goal. I'm sure that you asked other people in a volunteer committee, I'm going to ask you the same thing probably. But like, what was your goal for this? What do you think was the positive impact contributed for the audience overall? Like, what are your thoughts? Because that's mine, was that the desires, empathy and curiosity. But how about for you?
I definitely second those for sure. And I feel like understanding comes to mind, which I think, you have to have some sort of curiosity, some openness, a willingness, empathy to be able to have understanding, opening that door to understanding and true connected community,
Right.
where people can be themselves and work together towards problem solving and release the judgments that allow the barriers to come down, to dissolve. And I understand that there are sometimes we need to have safeties in place. So I'm not trying to, I'm not talking so much about those situations. It's more so that which really separates us and keeps patterns or conditions like status quo in ways that are restricting us and inhibit us from having those healthy connected relationships that we could have if we're more open, more caring, more empathetic.
I really agree with you 100%. So Amy, since you were a guest first and then you had all these multiple perspectives, and I know we touched on it a little bit, but beyond just the empathy, right? Was there what do you hope was the larger impact on the guest of the podcast, right? Because you were a guest, right? So what were the impact that you hope was on a guest and then also the listeners too?
Yes. Well, we have a lot of media in our world. A lot of stories are highlighted in all kinds of ways now. I'm in my 40s and I remember what things were like 25 years ago. They're a lot different than they are now. Stories can be kind of sold in a way and sensationalized and tore apart. And that's not what we were doing here. We're going to have conversations, and there's a certain purpose for this. And for the guests, it was to highlight that your story is important. We want to hear it. We care. It is held in care here. So I hope that our guests were offered a safe, caring space of true human to human connection more than anything, honestly. And then in their willingness to be vulnerable, to be courageous, to share part of their lives with us, often very tender parts of their lives, I hope that it was somehow empowering or healing or validating, affirming in healthy ways that help them as a human being. Those are some of my hopes to impact and whatever else they needed at the time, I guess. And for our listeners, we did touch on this in terms of the openness, but also how important they are for connecting in this way, for taking the time to care about another person's story, to maybe share, the podcast with other people, whatever kind of connection they have. Some are through the Cultural Awareness Coalition, some might have been through other work or volunteer efforts, but at the end of the day, they chose because they're part of community here in Midland or human beings on Earth, and they care about people enough to listen to these stories. So that's part of the impact I hope in, and then of course whatever ripples out from there.
Yeah, the ripples I hope are positive, right? That's our goal, is that we made direct impacts, hopefully, on these guests. And guests, if you're listening, previous guests, I hope that everything that Amy said there resonated with you, and we're like, yes, I stepped away from our conversation having a meaningful, human connection. That's our goal, right? And we wanted to share that real human connection with our listeners too. So that's the hope.
Yes.
And then the positive ripples from that come, for everybody's going to be impacted by these stories in their own way, right? So that's been a hope. I hope that our guests that walked away feeling that, and I hope our listeners have too.
Absolutely.
So it's a little bit of a sad note, though. Closing is a little sad, but everything runs its course. But what kind of encouragement do you want to give those who are wishing to continue to contribute to increasing connection and understanding to the local community? What kind of encouragement would you say to those people? Yes, the podcast may not be continuing in this form, but what encouragement do those have? You're like, you know what, this inspired me, or I like this concept of storytelling. What encouragement would you have for those listeners who are interested in doing more in their local communities?
My first invitation is face any fears or reservations you have and go connect.
Yeah.
You can do it at a coffee shop. You can do it on the sidewalk. You can go out to somebody that you know or don't know. You can also go, in most communities, there are ways to connect with each other, and you can start very simply. And also, if you have space and time and the heart or passion to do so, get involved in some community efforts like this, like other ones. I mean, the Cultural Awareness Coalition here they are involved with various initiatives. There are other organizations around. So really allow yourself to stretch. Maybe you're someone that already stretches, so that's not hard for you. Maybe invite somebody who doesn't to join you, in a conversation, and know that it does have impact and it has importance. And you never really know. I mean, sometimes people will share what the impact is with you, like we are here, but sometimes they won't, and the effort still matters.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How about you, Jeremiah? What encouragement would you like to give, because you spearheaded a lot of this?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, get involved, right? There are so many ways to get involved, and that doesn't. It's not a one size fits all. Like maybe you're not into going to an event, or maybe maybe it's not a podcast. There are so many opportunities to connect with others, and there's different mediums for doing that, whether that's in person, well, that's certainly something that I would encourage, right? Because that like meeting somebody on a sidewalk or on the street or whatever that looks like, and finding that authentic connection in person is the right way to go. But maybe that's not you. Like what is it going to be for you to find connection with somebody who's not like you, right? Think about, like, step outside of that. What does that look like? Who are those people? Who's a group of people you probably never have a conversation with? Have the courage, right, to like step out of your comfort zone and have that conversation and try to make a connection and be challenged. The willingness to be challenged in your own beliefs, right, too, and your own background. Because part of the reason I wanted to do this is I grew up in rural Tennessee, right? And I had limited exposure to people from different backgrounds and ideas. And it was a very homogenous society. And when you're in a homogenous society, like when you only see things that are presented to you, that's all the world you know. So it takes like a very deliberate effort to try to connect with people who aren't like you. And so my encouragement to people is like, just do it, try. And that doesn't have to be maybe in person if you're nervous about that, making a connection, striking up a conversation. It could be an online. There's so many, or 2023, you can find ways to do this, whether it's chat, whatever it looks like, find a way to find a connection. Find a way to step outside your comfort zone and find a way to give back, right? Like, and if that could be through community organizations like a Midland Inclusion Council, like Alliance, sorry, I may be butchering it, but the Midland Inclusion Alliance Council, whatever the term is, the Cultural Awareness Coalition, there is the Breaking Bread Village. That's just in our small community, and that's things off the top of my head, and there's so many more, right? Mm-hmm. In your own community. Maybe you don't live in Midland. Maybe you're listening to this from San Francisco, where I'm at. So there's so many opportunities here. It's that willingness to step outside and be like, hey, I don't know about this, but I want to make a positive impact. And just being vulnerable enough to know that you can make an impact in one way or another. And it doesn't have to be through some grand thing. That impact can just be a conversation with another individual, and that alone can change the world. So that connection building, if you can build on that, then and you make an impact on one other person, that's what we all should be doing, right? Creating that personal connections with others.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So
thanks, Jeremiah.
Thank you. And yeah, we're kind of getting to the end of this today's, I guess.
Yeah.
So, which is really sad to say, but what would you want our listeners to walk away with? Like I always, every one of our episodes, and I think you did the same, would be like our last question to our guests would be, what are your final words to our listeners? So Amy, after 3 years and 33 episodes or so, what would be your final words to our listeners?
Story is important. Your story, another person's story. And in the spirit of the Human Library that turned into the Visibility Project podcast, I would invite everyone to consider how true that is. We are here from breath to breath, beginning breath and ending breath, and there's a whole story in between. So what space can you create to honor your own story, honor another's by listening, by sharing in that, and sharing in the process of the fact that our stories are in continual creation. And efforts like this and in our communities help us be able to honor and reroute stories when we need to. We're not always going to agree. We're not always going to feel a kinship with somebody, but we do share the human journey of walking and living a story. So how can we continue to connect in that? And just, I share those invitations as questions that we're all walking with, living questions. I think that's the best way I can leave this podcast. And I want to thank thank everybody who's participated and contributed, listeners, guests, all of us who've been working on the podcast.
Awesome. I don't have anything to follow up after that. Amy, geez, you just hit the nail on the head.
I gotta say, what are your final words, Jeremiah,
Yes,
to our listeners?
Can I say ditto? No, I would say stay curious, right? It is about curiosity and the differences in others, I think, right? And those differences really what make life interesting. If we only talk to people who think and act like us, it limits the vibrant nature of our society, right? We are all so different, have our own stories and our own background. From breath to breath, he said it so wonderfully, right? From breath to breath, we have all these lived experiences, and everybody has their own story. And if we just step out of our own shoes and in the shoes out of our own comfort zone, and it's natural. We all our comfort zone is sharing things that are very common to us, right? And we want to you like the TV shows I like, you like the things I like. Let's be friends, right? We share a common interest. That's normal. That's human, right? It is not as normal to step outside of our comfort zone and to be vulnerable and to ask curious questions and to listen critically and listen carefully and listen with an open ear and out of a place of without judgment, right? Somebody's story is different than yours. Why? What is their lived experience? Why? What informed them to think and see the world the way they do? And from that, right, then we can start to make real connections with one another. So I guess stay curious, try to make those connections, particularly with people who are different than you, right? Or have different lived experiences than you. And to me personally, that's what makes life interesting, is finding out and growing and learning and making those connections. And that's what I hope this podcast did, right? As we helped expose some people to maybe some stories that maybe they haven't heard before, right? And empathize with people maybe they've never spoken to before or had an experience with. And that was the purpose of both the Human Library and the purpose of this podcast. And I hope then from those stories, you start to have a ripple, right? And be like, you start to rethink how you view the world and how you start to interact with people and approach relationship with a more empathetic and humble perspective, right? And with that too, I mean, this whole podcast, everything, this is not a Amy and Jeremiah show. There's a whole group of us that worked on this. I want to thank our producers. We had two different Adams, we have two different Adams, both who are producers, worked with us. We had the support of the CAC. We had support of private donors to help financially to support the podcast. We have had so many volunteers to step in with transcriptions and with project management. Honestly, thank you to everyone who helped make this podcast a success, and particularly those who came on the podcast to share their stories, because that vulnerability and willingness to share your stories is what it's all about. And it's nerve-wracking, right? So thank you to all of you who came on to share their stories, and thank you to all the listeners who stayed with us over the years. Please re-listen to the episodes and find your own ways of making connections and staying curious and hearing the stories of those who may have different lived experiences than you. Thank you again, everybody.
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for your contributions, just like Jeremiah said, and thank you for continuing this work in your own ways. Although this podcast is now transitioning into a close, we know that this work continues, person to person and community to community. So thank you all so much.
The work's not done.
Nope.
The work's never done.
It lives on. Thank you.
You can stay connected with the Visibility Project by subscribing, liking, and sharing on your favorite podcasting and social apps. Look for us at the Visibility PRJ.
Financial support is needed to keep the conversation going. Go to midlandfoundation.org/give and select the Cultural Awareness Coalition Endowment Fund to be part of the project. Note podcast in your donation notes.
Thank you for listening.
We see you.
We hear you.
And together, we are making a difference.